Hello, and thank you all very much for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate it. So in this session where we talk about Are You Well-Architected, I'm going to be covering a lot of information about the Well-Architected Framework and the content and resources that are available to help you determine Are You Well-Architected. So my name is John Steele. I'm a Cloud Operations Specialist as part of the AWS Enterprise Support team. So what I'm going to talk about today is well-architected at an introductory level so you can understand what is the well-architected framework, what are the resources that come along with that, and what's the real value proposition? What are we trying to do for our customers with this framework? We're also going to walk through an actual presentation, the virtual workshop section, where we explain how to use the tool and some best practices around getting the most value from the tool. After that, we're also going to dive a little deeper into the other content resources besides just the recently released Well-Architected Tool that can help you to better utilize the whole Well-Architected framework. So we're going to get started here. First thing that I want you to do is take a moment and think about the Well-Architected framework is designed really to help customers understand what's different when it comes to the cloud. So take a moment and think, are you in the cloud right now? Are you using AWS? Are you using cloud? Are you using a hybrid cloud environment? And if you're doing that, do you know whether or not you're well architected? So that's really what we're trying to help customers answer. So if you take a moment and think about it, we would really hope that most customers, when we ask that question, would be able to say, sure, I'm well architected. And really when they're diving in to start their journey in the cloud, they probably want to be well architected to begin with. So thinking about it for a second, if you're well architected, many people would say, yes, sure I am. The challenge is that when we start thinking about well-architected, we like to dive a little bit deeper. So as you start to dive deeper, in this session, we're really going to talk about more than just the general question, are you well-architected? But we're actually going to talk about, are you well-architected around these 5 pillars? So we have concepts around operational excellence, security, reliability, performance efficiency, and cost optimization. And what we see with a lot of customers is we may ask, are you well architected? And initially at top level, you say yes. But when we begin to dive deeper into these areas, often the answer is not quite the same. And some of these areas you may know there's things that we're not doing as well as we should. We may have opportunities to improve. So let's move on and think a little bit more about what you can do with the well-architected framework to better answer that question, are you well architected? So we think across those 5 pillars. What is it that those pillars are really helping us to do? So take a look at those 5 pillars and think for a moment, if you had to take every workload that you have, so when we think about a workload, we're thinking about a set of systems or services that are used to provide business value. So if you think about all of the things that you have in your business that you use as software or technology to provide business value, do you know on a regular basis if you're well architected across those 5 different concepts? So if you think about those different concepts, the reason we have well-architected is to really help customers apply this more consistently. So we want you to be able to have a process that allows you to review and understand those workloads on a consistent basis and to do it throughout your entire technology portfolio. So that's really why we're here today. This is the reason that AWS created the Well-Architected Framework. So you can see here, Well-Architected encompasses a lot of different resources and a lot of different content to help our customers answer the question of whether or not they're well-architected. So as you're beginning to build systems, before we start talking about well-architected, what would probably help is a little bit of history. Where did well-architected come from? So here's the history of well-architected. It really started back in 2012. So solutions architects began with the idea of just going to customers and asking them, are you well architected? And over time, that developed into a common set of questions that solutions architects were using to ask customers, are you well architected? Do you know what AWS's best practices are for architecting in the cloud? So in 2013, there was a lot of different questions that were being asked by solutions architects, but over time it was sort of recognized that we needed to be more consistent in that and create a consistent set of best practices for customers to ask themselves about. So that's really in 2014 where we came to the questions being based across those 4 pillars originally of security, reliability, cost optimization, and performance efficiency. Now, over the course of time, we continue to expand that framework. And the thing that we want you to see is really well-architected is a continuously evolving thing based on the best practices we've learned from working with customers. So in 2015, we recognized not all customers have access to a solutions architect. We actually published the Well-Architected Framework as a white paper that sort of incorporates all the best practices we'd learned from doing thousands of these reviews with our customers. Over the course of time then, we were able to add the operational excellence pillar back in 2016. And then in 2017, we made it so that our AWS Partner Network partners could become trained to deliver the same level of value that SAs were delivering for customers using the Well-Architected Framework too. Then last year at reInvent, we were able to launch the self-service Well-Architected Tool, which is in fact what we're going to be covering today in our virtual workshop. And along with that tool, we recognized that customers didn't just want to know what are AWS's best practices and what should I be doing, but if they were able to recognize risks in their environment by using that tool, how should they be addressing or mitigating those risks? So that's where we ended up with the self-service tool and improvement plans embedded in that tool. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. The important thing to recognize, though, is that Well-Architected is based upon AWS's long history of working with customers to help understand what they were doing and what was working. The key is these best practices are based upon our work with customers because that's how we have developed these best practices. So I now want to jump in and actually talk about what is the Well-Architected Framework. So the Well-Architected Framework covers a lot of different content. So first thing we're going to do is talk about why we would want to use the Well-Architected Framework. What is the point of this? What are we trying to do for customers? So really at its root, the most important thing is we're trying to make it so that customers can build and deploy faster. And the way that works is that we want them to reduce their tactical firefighting efforts and be able to think about things like capacity management and automation and security and some of the things that are different in the cloud in a way that will make them able to experiment and release more often, because we don't want customers to focus on just fixing things. Rather, we want them to be able to focus on delivering business value and doing that more quickly. Now, one of the ways that happens is by helping customers to identify risks and then to reduce or mitigate those risks. So when customers understand what the tested and true best practices are for operating and designing in the cloud, they're able to reduce risk before they go into production. Something else that's really important is when you understand what risks are, it allows you to make informed decisions. So we recognize in modern complex systems, it's impossible to completely prevent or remove all risk from an environment. So the goal is to help customers understand what their risks are and to make an informed decision using data around those risks before they move things into production and while they're operating and supporting their workloads. And then the last thing is customers have been coming to us for a long time asking, how does AWS recommend I do this? What is AWS's best practice for this? So the goal of the Well-Architected Framework is to try and collect and aggregate all those best practices around design decisions for cloud-based workloads and determine what are they and expose them to customers so that you can learn those best practices on your own. So that's why we created the Well-Architected Framework. Now, what really does the Well-Architected Framework do for you? So we see it as a central part, as a mechanism for your cloud journey. So what do we mean as a mechanism? So if you actually take a look at several talks that have been done by Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, he talks about mechanisms as a very important alternative to best intentions. We all have good intentions. We all want to do the right thing. The problem is that sometimes good intentions are not enough. So the idea behind having a mechanism is a repeatable process that allows you to improve it over time. So we see Well-Architected as a way to make those improvements through a repeatable process over time. It will let you learn the strategies and best practices for architecting and operating workloads in the cloud. And more importantly, it doesn't just help you learn those best practices, it creates a consistent way for you to actually measure against the best practices and determine if you have any risks. Once those risks have been identified because you've been able to measure against them consistently, you should then be able to make improvements over time. So you'll see consistent improvement in your operational excellence and the design of your workloads. So what goes into the Well-Architected Framework? So in the Well-Architected Framework, it really consists of three things. Pillars, those 5 pillars we discussed, as well as design principles. Now there's 2 kinds of design principles, and we'll talk about them more a little bit later, but we have general design principles, which are overarching principles we see should be used across all of the design, as well as design principles that are specific to each one of those 5 pillars. Then we have questions, and really those questions are designed to help you look at the design principles and best practices in those pillars and determine, are you aligned? Do you know what they are? Are you following them? And if you're not, what risks do they present? And what should you do to try and reduce or mitigate that risk? So the pillars of Well-Architected here, we really want you to think about them by way of analogy. Think of it like a building. So I just happen to be here in Seattle today. In Seattle, if you have ever been here, you'll see that we're constantly building new buildings here in downtown Seattle. And if you look at a lot of the buildings, we see that it seems like the construction of the building, over half of the time is spent before the building even starts to rise up into the sky. A huge portion of the time is spent building a really strong, solid foundation for those buildings. So we want you to really think about Well-Architected in that same way. If you want to have all of the technologies that you use to provide business value be stable, be strong, be things that are designed to give the business value that you want them to give, the best way to do that is by building a good foundation. So those 5 pillars in Well-Architected are designed to help you build a strong foundation for all of your workload and to identify any issues through that consistent measurement and help to reduce or mitigate those so that you can have that strong foundation in your technology portfolio. So as I mentioned before, there are 3 major components within the Well-Architected framework. So our first one here is the general design principles and the pillar-specific design principles. So if we take a look at some general principles, for example, one of the general design principles is automate responses to security events. And we think about this as something that's different in the cloud than it may have been in on-premise environments. You know, in a traditional IT environment, you may have the one person that responds to that alarm that goes off, and that one security engineer is going to jump in, is going to do what's necessary and respond to a perceived security incident and help to mitigate that risk. There's some problems with that, though, because having that one person, when they're woken up at 2 a.m., it puts a lot of stress and load on them. It also means they're responding at 2 a.m. and may not be the clearest. And also because it's a person doing the response, sometimes manual effort means that humans are prone to error, especially at 2 a.m., and there's the potential that they're not going to have the best response, or the responses will vary across your environment. So when we think about the design principle of automating responses, it means you will have a consistent and automated response that helps to ease a lot of those burdens. That's one of the benefits you can get from the cloud. So there are other design principles, and we can talk about them later. They're also available in the framework, so we highly encourage you to take a look at those good overarching principles. There are also those individual design principles that are part of each one of the pillars. So each of the 5 pillars also begins with design principles that are overarching for that concept that we think you should take advantage of. So let's then talk about the next component within the Well-Architected framework, and it's the questions. So as mentioned at the beginning, this is all about asking the question, are you well-architected? So in order to do that, it all is based on this question framework. So the questions here, we have one of the questions from the reliability pillar. And if we look at the general structure of the question, it starts with the area that it comes from. So all of the pillars are broken up into areas. This particular question is from the failure management area of the reliability pillar. And we begin with a question. So the question is, how is your system designed to withstand component failures? Now below that question, then we have some context. The context is designed to give you a brief understanding of how does that relate to you and how would you think about that in your environment and against your workloads. Now, underneath that, we then have the list of all of the best practices that we have seen other customers be successful with. So these are some examples that we highly encourage you to consider implementing in your environments. As mentioned before, these are the best practices that we have found from working with customers over the tens and thousands of reviews that we have actually done with customers since 2012 when we started the Well-Architected framework. Now, if you're using all of these, it's going to actually help you looking at each of these questions to learn what our best practices are, as you see listed here, the best practices, to measure yourself against those best practices, and then to make improvements in your architecture by addressing or mitigating the risks that are identified here over time. So what all else is available within the Well-Architected framework? Well, really, the Well-Architected framework is basically broken down into 3 major areas, and those are content, the Well-Architected tool, and then the data that is derived from those. And we'll talk about how each of those can be used as a different use case for the Well-Architected framework. So if you look at the content, this is really where it began. So the content includes things like the framework with the design principles, the individual pillar frameworks that have different design principles for each pillar, as well as all of the questions and best practices. Even if you decide not to use a well-architected tool, you should note that the framework is where it started, and all of the questions and best practices are actually available in the Well-Architected Framework white papers that are available online. You will also see there's a lot of other helpful resources, including we have the entire Well-Architected Tool content is also available on an external website. So you can see all the material that's in the tool externally if you would like. And then we do have the tool as well. So the tool is designed to allow you to have a self-service or guided by AWS to support walking you through the well-architected tool questions. So that tool and the content combined are really designed to give you data. That's kind of the end goal that we're trying to get here. So that data allows you to get documentation about your workloads, to see your entire technology portfolio, to understand things like the description, the regions, which of those 5 pillars is the highest priority for a particular workload, and then allow you to do reviews and aggregate things around what risks have been identified for those workloads. So there's a lot of resources that become available since 2012 now in the Well-Architected Framework. We're going to talk through some of those and how you could use them. So before we go any further, we're going to jump over here and do a quick poll. So we'll bring up the poll for you. As the poll comes up, we'll just talk through the options here. So my question before I actually jump into the demo and walk you through the Well-Architected tool is, have you ever used it before? So if you've used it, A is no, you have never used it before. B is yes, but you haven't actually completed an entire review, all 46 questions across those 5 different pillars. Yes, you have completed 1 review, or yes, and you've completed more than 5 reviews, which is great. So we're looking to have that poll fill in. About how much longer should we wait for the poll? Okay. All right. And as everyone is filling out that poll, I'll tell you what we have coming up next. In a second here, I am going to switch over and actually give you the virtual workshop portion of today's session. We're going to do a walkthrough of the tool using a lab that's actually available externally. So I'll get you all set up for that. Give you a few more seconds here to answer the poll question. All right, so I am going to jump out of my presentation now, and we will be switching over to show you the Well-Architected tool. So what I have here actually is the Well-Architected Labs. We're going to talk a little bit more about the other lab content that's available, but I'm going to begin by starting with the level 100 walkthrough of the Well-Architected tool. So this lab that I'm showing you here is what we're going to cover in today's workshop content. So if you would like, in the sessions, there should be a shortened link that you can click on that will take you to this lab. You can also just go to wellarchitectedlabs.com, and this will give you access to this lab. These labs all are open sourced. So there are labs actually for all 5 of the pillars we'll talk about in a little bit. But for today's workshop, we're going to walk through this lab together. So if you'd like to follow along, you're more than welcome to go here. So what I'm doing is to do the lab, we're actually going to do this in the console together. So I'll give everyone a moment. If you didn't see this, give you a few seconds here. If you have an AWS account, please log into that AWS account. You need to have an account that has permissions to use the Well-Architected tool. And we're going to walk through using Well-Architected. So I'll give everyone about 15, 20 seconds here to do that. And as well, if you've logged into the console and you want to follow along in the lab, you're welcome to do that too. All right, so I'm here in the AWS Management Console. There are a lot of different ways to get to the resources in the console, so I'll show you some of them. You will note, because I have been to the Well-Architected tool in the past in this console, it shows it at the top. You also are able to just type in Well-Architected, and you'll see the tool shows up there. As well, if you want, in all services, the Well-Architected tool is a part of the management and governance group on the website. So if you want to scroll to management and governance, you can get to Well-Architected tool through here. So I'm going to click to take me to the Well-Architected tool. A couple of key things about the tool as we begin walking through it. First off, you'll see that the Well-Architected tool is available in several regions. The reason that we do this is if there is information that you believe to be sensitive that you want to store in the notes for the tool, you have the ability to store it in regions that are compliant with whatever your compliance needs are. So these are the different regions that are currently offered, and it will continue to expand. In this case, as I mentioned before, I'm in Seattle, so I'm going to choose my closest region, US West 2, which is Oregon. And I'm going to go to the Well-Architected tool page and actually define a workload. So let's start with defining a workload. I'd mentioned before what a workload is. So a workload is something that we allow you as the customer to elect the definition of that, but we want you to start from thinking about a group of systems and services that you use together to provide business value. So for some customers, it may be a small microservice within a larger architecture. For some customers, it may be multiple services put together that perform whatever is necessary to produce a particular product. For some, it may be a set of products that all work together to provide a particular set of features or services. We leave it up to you as the customer to decide how you would like to do that. But to start with, in defining a workload, I have to give it a name. So I'm going to call this the virtual workshop workload. We do want you to give it a good description. In this case, I think my description is fairly self-explanatory. As we'll talk about later, we highly recommend that you use the Well-Architected tool throughout the lifecycle, including doing it as early as possible. So I'm going to say that I'm in a pre-production environment. You will also notice that the way that the Well-Architected tool is set up, it is designed around best practices that really are not just specific to AWS. So you can, if you would like, for documentation purposes, choose the regions you're in. So I may choose US West Oregon. You can see that Oregon has now been selected. But if you want, you also have the ability to run the tool against environments that are not in AWS. So you can look at architectures that span AWS, even other cloud providers, or your on-premise environment. Lastly, you do have the option to put in an account ID. Now, the sections here at the bottom, these are optional as well. If you want to classify, because you have maybe multiple workloads that you'll be aggregating, you do have the ability to choose an industry and industry type if you would like. Those are optional, but not required, but they do allow you to group and categorize when it comes to searching, especially if you have your entire technology portfolio. Those can be very useful. So I'm not going to choose define workload. And you can see now I have my workload defined. Now, once the workload is defined, we have a lot of options here, and we'll walk through what each of these screens does for you, but I'm actually just going to jump in and start my review. Now, my screen is kind of zoomed in here, so I'll zoom out to show you what I have over here on the left-hand side. You can see that it shows me my 5 pillars and the number of questions that I have answered from each one of the pillars. For those of you that are following on the lab guide, you will see that Rodney, who is the reliability lead for Well-Architected in the lab, goes through the reliability pillar. I'm actually going to go through operational excellence because I am from the cloud operations team. I'm also one of the people that helped to author the operational excellence pillar, but you're welcome to follow along in the lab if you would like to do the reliability pillar. So as I zoom in a little bit more, let's talk through the components that we see here on the screen. So on the screen, as we mentioned before, we have the question, how do you determine what your priorities are? I have the ability to get some more information on it. Also, at the bottom, I have the overall context that helps you to understand, well, what do we mean by this question? You will note then, underneath that, you can select which of the best practices apply to the workload that you are doing a review against. For each one of those best practices, you'll note there's an info link. That info link actually takes you over here to the sidebar where we have additional resources. So for evaluate external customer needs as an example, you can see that this gives me more detail about what do we mean when we say evaluating external customer needs. And more importantly, as I mentioned, all of the content for Well-Architected is available in an external website as well. So part of that includes a bunch of definitions for terminology. So in this case, definitions for what operations means. These links will actually take you to the external site. So if you want to dive in more and understand what we mean with certain words that you may not be familiar with, you can click on them in order to see that. So for each one of these best practices around the question, you would select whether or not you believe you're following those best practices. You will notice we have an option at the very bottom that is a none of these options. So you may note looking at this, either I myself am not able to answer those because I need another team to give me the answer, or alternatively, it may be you just recognize those are all weaknesses or areas that you would like to do improvement. So you can mark none of these and it will automatically deselect all of them. Alternatively, if you're not sure, you can not use none of these and instead not check any of them so that you know you need to come back to that question to answer it in the future. As well, at the top, for some of the questions, you may determine for a specific workload, certain things don't really apply to that workload. So if you don't want to see risks come up associated to that workload because you know that is not something that matters. So perhaps you have questions when we get further down into Well-Architected about how you are using Direct Connect or monitoring VPN connections. Maybe that's not applicable because you're not using those. You have the option to say that that question does not apply to your workload, and you won't see any risks associated with the workload show up around that question. So Lastly, what we believe really is the most important part of Well-Architected beyond those best practices is your ability to document where you're at. So you have this notes section at the bottom. While it is optional, we highly recommend, we're going to talk more about best practices around Well-Architected, but we highly recommend that you consider taking really good thorough notes. This is an opportunity to really document your workload and how you are performing against the Well-Architected best practices for that workload. So if I check these checkboxes, we'll give you an example of what this will look like. So I'll check a couple of checkboxes and then I choose next. Takes me to the next question. The same thing again. I can check the checkboxes for what I'm doing. Choose next. Again, we recommend you not make this a checkbox exercise, but much more focus on driving discussion. But I'm going to check some of these just so you can get an idea of what our output looks like. So I'll maybe pick one where I say it doesn't apply because perhaps I don't have the answers to this. When it comes to deployment mitigation, there's a different team that manages that and they'll be reviewing it. So I'm going that far, choose save and exit. So this takes me back out to the actual workload review that I've started for my virtual workshop. Now you see that until I've answered all 46 questions, I have the option to continue the review, but let's talk through a few of the other really important components that are available here. So you can see that so far I have answered 4 of the 46 questions. You will note that I don't currently have any high risk items, but I do have some medium risk items. I want to demonstrate what happens, say for example, that I zoom out here. Let's say that I go down here to understanding the health of my workload. And on understanding the health of my workload, I say that, I'm really only identifying KPIs that have workload metrics, but across the board and everything else, I'm not doing as well as I know I should be. So if I choose save and exit at that point, go back to the review, you'll now see that I have an area where I'm not doing very well, and it's identified that as a high risk. So now with the questions that are answered, 5 out of the 46, 1 of them is a high risk and 3 of them are medium risk. So what do I do with this information and how does that help me? So you can see here that I'm going to get a list of what the risks are that I should be addressing in order. You'll see at the bottom, I can see the questions that are answered and the risks per pillar. But if we go up here to the top to the improvement plan allows us to see what we should do to actually start working on this. Now, I can track the status of my improvements. So if I want to be able to see for my entire technology portfolio, all of the reviews that I'm doing, I can set the status on each of those reviews and whether or not I've started working on them. Is it not started, in progress, complete, or have I just acknowledged I know there's a risk there, but it's not something I can put into my backlog of work to mitigate right now. Now you'll also notice that we have this improvement plan configuration. Currently for this review, security, reliability, operational excellence, performance, and cost is my order of priority by pillar. If you choose though, you can go into edit and either using the arrows to move up and down, or in this case, as I mentioned, I'm doing this around operational excellence. So to me, that's the most important. I can move that to the highest priority and I save that. And now in my improvement plan, I've put operational excellence as the highest priority for me on this workload. You notice you also can go through the improvement items and you can filter them by risk or by pillar. So if there are areas of improvement needed, you'll see in my improvement plan, when I said, how do you understand health of your workload, I didn't select the necessary things to really move me out of this being a high risk area. So you'll see in the improvement plan, it gives me a list of links that can take me to more materials and resources that I can use to do either reduction of risk or risk mitigation against those findings. So that's how the improvement plan works. And you'll see for every one of the items where there's either a high or medium risk identified, you'll have an improvement plan that incorporates a lot of information that you can use to start making progress on reducing or mitigating that risk. So we'll also see then something that's very important. As I mentioned, we do not think that you should use Well-Architected as just a point in time. Rather, it's designed to help you make improvements over time. So to make improvements over time, one important way to do that is the functionality that we have here called milestones. So with milestones, if I know that this is my initial review, I can save this as a milestone. So I'm going to choose Save Milestone, and I'm going to call this my initial review. So I've marked it as initial review, and I choose Save. So what did I actually do by saving that milestone? Well, now when I go to my Milestones tab, you'll see I have a milestone listed. It says that I've answered 5 of 46. I have 1 high risk and 1 medium risk issue. If I go and do an effort to reduce or mitigate those risks by following the improvement plan that's established and well-architected, or by working with my solutions architect or account team, or by working with a partner, and I've reduced those risks, I can then over time come back to the review and I can continue it. So when I jump back into the review, What if I know on that particular question about understanding my workload health, I've actually done things that are necessary, and now I collect and analyze workload metrics, I have my metrics baselines, I have the ability to look at patterns of activity, and I have alerts set up for both when my outcomes are at risk and also for when I've detected anomalies. So I've established a lot of good monitoring practices around understanding my workload health, and I can say that I have implemented better monitoring. So I now choose Save and Exit. I'm going to make this as another milestone. So I've made changes. So this milestone is better monitoring. So I save that milestone. Now when I go back to my Milestones tab, you'll see that in Milestones, I have 2 milestones. So for this one, notice I no longer have any high risk. It's actually marked it as no high risk and only 4 medium risks. Whereas initial review, I had 1 high risk and 3 medium risks. By using milestones, we have the ability to see over time improvements that are being made on our workloads. So it allows you to see if you're making improvements, and in fact allows you to go back. So for example, if I pick my initial review, I can choose to view that milestone by clicking on it or choosing the View Milestone button. And now I see that snapshot of before I'd made the changes or improvements. In fact, I can go in and I can view the review, and when I view the review, it'll actually let me see. You'll note that I can't make changes because it's a milestone, so the milestone is now set as a point in time, but I can see where I was, and I can go back to understanding the health of my workload. I've made changes, and I've made additions and notes. So that's the way that we can actually use the milestones capability to actually track and see improvements that we're making over time. All right, so back in my milestones, I can also jump into the current milestone, and I'm able to generate a report from that. So you can generate a report from any milestone or generate a report from the current state of any of the well-architected reviews. So when I choose to generate report, what generate report is doing is taking this content and putting it into a PDF, and it's going to allow me to take that and export it and send it to other people or to archive it and track it over time if I would like. So we'll take all of the content as well as the links to the different things that we recommend that you do in terms of improvement. So those the improvement plans that have been established, those will all be generated and put into that report. So that should cover all of the basic information about using the Well-Architected tool. Just to give you a quick review of the Well-Architected tool, this has allowed us to set up a new workload, get the details of what it looks like when we performed a workload, to see risks that we should address, get an overview of what content we've answered, allows us to see improvement plans for questions that we've answered so far. We've been able to create milestones and track those improvements over time using the milestones. And then if I go back to my workloads page, you'll also see I can see a list of all the workloads for a particular region aggregated together. And if I use the dashboard, if I had multiple workloads, I would actually be able to see each one of the workloads listed here together and see what milestones or risks have been done by selecting it. You can see it gives me a high-level overview of what milestones I have for any workload that's in that master list. All right. So that concludes the overview of the Well-Architected tool that we had for today. So there is your virtual workshop on Well-Architected tool. What we're going to do now is we're going to switch back to the presentation and give you a little bit more information on what else is available in the Well-Architected framework to help you. So we're going to start by actually talking about how to apply Well-Architected. So now we have a tool. You know that you can use the tool. You've gotten a good basic overview of the tool, but let's actually figure out what are some ways that Well-Architected can help you. Now that you have a tool and you know where the resources and content are, how can you use that to make some improvements? So the first thing that's most important, as I mentioned before, I want to dive into this a little deeper. So what is the purpose or the intent of doing a review? There's a couple key things to think about. Most importantly, we don't want reviews to be thought of as an audit. So this is not something where it's exhaustive and we want you to get a pass or fail mark on this. Rather, reviews are very much designed to be discussion-driven approach to dive into your architectures and understand what your risks are. So the important thing to think about is when you're doing this, it should be a blame-free conversation. This is not about pointing out what's being done wrong, and it's definitely not about getting a red, yellow, or green score. It's about understanding what the best practices are, learning from them, and being able to measure whether or not you're aligned to those best practices. Now, once you've done that, thinking about those best practices, we really want you to think about those best practices as being very pragmatic and proven advice. So we mentioned here, it's not architecture astronauts. What we mean is this is not theoretical. So we're not giving you a list of theoretical best practices that are some perfect future state that no one can attain. Rather, remember, these best practices have been learned from our customers. So if you know much about the AWS approach to when it comes to designing our services, we design 90 to 95% of our features based on what the customer has asked for, or what our customers want. So the same thing is very much true when it comes to Well-Architected. Those best practices are what we have gotten from learning from our customers. Our customers have driven us to understand what's actually working for them. So when you see those best practices, they are proven based upon what we've seen customers actually doing. Another thing that's really important to think about when it comes to using Well-Architected is it shouldn't be a point in time or a one-time only check. Set it, forget it, and you're done. Rather, we want you to think about using the Well-Architected tool and the Well-Architected framework as something that you do throughout the life cycle of your applications and your technology portfolio. So you should do this not only before you, while you're designing a workload or something that you do before it goes into production, but you should also continuously do that because as we've learned, while AWS is continuously improving, launching new features, new services, and new capabilities for our customers, it also means customers and AWS are finding new best practices for operating in the cloud all the time. We're going to continue to add those, so it's something that you should consider not just as your workloads change, but also as there's new things available in AWS. How could running Well-Architected again benefit you? So it's another thing to think about when it comes to the intent of the review. So we know that choice is very important. So how can you actually do a review? Well, there's really 3 different choices that you have for doing a review. Now, the first is, since we last year at re:Invent were able to launch the Well-Architected tool in the console for you, you do have the ability now to do a review self-service. And if you did that with your team, we highly suggest that you have both your technical leads as well as the business leadership, because we really want to make sure that there's an alignment between what the business needs are of your workloads and the teams that are supporting that. So as a technical team and your business leads, you can sit down with the Well-Architected tool and do the review on your own as a self-service exercise using your console. Also, you can do it with a partner. So we have the APN network, a lot of AWS partners, and in that partner network, you can find partners that are trained to use Well-Architected and can sit down and do the engagement with you. Again, most often doing it in the console where you walk through with the partner in your own console and have discussions about the questions and best practices in Well-Architected. Then lastly, we also have the opportunity to do this with solutions architects. So if you have an account team and you have a solutions architect that you can get engaged with, you can have your solutions architect, or if you are on enterprise support and you have a technical account manager, your TAM can also help you out with doing these well-architected reviews. So you can have AWS come in and do it. Now, thinking about those review choices, the next important question is, all right, which one should I use and what's the benefit of each? So let's have a brief discussion about the benefits. So the benefit to doing it self-service is that you really have full control. You can choose how often you're going to do it, when you're going to do it, how much content you're going to cover. We have recognized there are 46 questions. There can be a lot of depth of discussion. Sometimes you may only want to do a few questions or maybe one pillar at a time. By doing self-service, it lets you choose how and when the best time is in order to do the review. More importantly, if you're going to do the review across a really wide array of workloads, maybe you want to cover your entire technology portfolio, it's really important that you have the control to do that so that you can choose when those different products are going to go through the review process, and you don't have to work with a partner or a solutions architect every time you want to do it. So there's a lot of benefit from that, and we'd highly recommend you consider it becoming a regular part of your team's approach. Now, the benefit to having a partner do it is that often, once you've gone through the review, you may recognize that you don't necessarily have the skills, expertise, or time necessary to apply the necessary remediations to either reduce or mitigate the risks that are identified. So if you need assistance where you can actually have someone come in that has skilled resources that can help to solve for those risks that have been identified, you can bring in a partner and they can really help you with addressing those risks. Now, lastly, we have the AWS Solutions Architects or anyone else on your account team that has been trained to deliver these. Now, there's a lot of benefit to having the skilled resources of an AWS Solutions Architect, as the Solutions Architect team has done tens of thousands of these since 2012. However, as is recognized, many of you may not have direct access to a Solutions Architect, or it may be difficult to have an SA go through all of the workloads that you want to do because you have such a wide array of things in your technology portfolio. So for that reason, we highly recommend that you consider when you're going to do it with an SA or with your account team, think about doing it against your most critical workloads. Another way that a lot of customers tend to approach this is when they're doing their first review, they're going to bring in a solutions architect to help them understand how to do it, treat it essentially as a well-architected workshop, train the trainer, so to speak. We're going to teach you how to use the tool effectively so that the people on your teams can then go out and do that again with all of their own individual workloads. The other thing is by having someone that has a lot of experience with well-architected, like solutions architects do, it's going to have really good guided advice on how to implement that improvement plan and how to prioritize the improvements that you need to make. So let's talk about the partner well-architected reviews and what you get out of having the partner well-architected reviews done. So engaging with a well-architected partner is great because for most of our partners, actually, it allows you to get a free review from them. So the well-architected partners are able to give you a review for free. Now, what comes out of that review is usually a statement of work about how to address any of the risks that are identified. How are they going to help you make improvements? So usually what the partner is going to do is the review for free and then come back to tell you how they can help you make the implementation of the risk, addressing risk through implementing new features, new capabilities, reducing or mitigating risks that have been identified. Now, we recognize, though, that for a lot of you, having a partner come in and do that means there is a cost involved in that. So one of the things that AWS does, because we really want to see you succeed in reducing or mitigating those risks, is if you have one of the partners come in and do the review, and have an approved statement of work, if you begin to work on that approved statement of work within 30 days of the review being done, we'll actually give you a $5,000 credit toward your AWS usage in order to help defray some of the costs involved in reducing or mitigating those risks. So that's, again, one of the benefits of having a partner well-architected review done, and that's what it looks like. Now, there are a wide range of partners that are available to assist you. You can see I have it here on the screen as well. If you just go to the Well-Architected page, on the Well-Architected page, you can see a list of the partners that are available. We have many partners in several different regions. So if you'd like, you can reach out to one of these partners and they can help you to get set up to guide you through a review as well. As I mentioned, we really think about Well-Architected as something that we want to continuously improve and adapt based on what best practices are as they develop over time. So we want to constantly be able to offer you up-to-date best practices around cloud architecture and cloud operations. So with that said, what have we learned? Since 2012 when this launched, you've seen there's a lot of new things that have come out of the Well-Architected framework, but what have we learned since we launched? So the first thing is we've recognized that really it's not about just doing it before launch. Now, we do see something that's very important. Launching, going in and using Well-Architected as a review tool before you do a launch, so we consider it an operational readiness review, is a really good thing. But the reality is, the earlier in the design phase that you can do Well-Architected, the more benefit that you're going to see. So really, earlier is better. That's the biggest thing that we've seen. Now, when we say earlier is better, that may mean doing it during the design phase. So when you're sitting down, you have the first designs for a new workload or a new feature. You go in and use Well-Architected to see if you're following best practices. It may also mean that it's something that you're going to do as a part of the operational readiness review before you launch into production. And it may be that you're actually going to use Well-Architected as a regular or repeat process done on an annual or a more frequent basis against existing workloads to determine if those workloads continue to use best practices. Something else is really important we've learned is that it's usually not identifying where people have made bad decisions. So what we're saying is it's not really about making bad decisions. Rather, in very complex systems, which most modern systems tend to be these days, in complex systems, it's often really about the decision that wasn't made. So for example, most people don't choose, I don't want a backup, so I'm not going to have a backup plan. What really tends to happen is in the complexity of an environment and getting it up and running, it's because someone didn't think about, oh yeah, I need to figure out backups for my environment. So it's usually the decision is made because of a lack of awareness of what should be done. So the benefit of using Well-Architected, and the thing we've learned is for customers, you really shouldn't think about the Well-Architected as just being a list of all of the things that you have done wrong. Rather, think about it of all of the things you should be thinking about when it comes to a workload. And that really then comes down to this final learning is findings. We really do not think of findings as mistakes or things that people are doing wrong. Findings should not be considered something that's bad, because the reality is the findings are actually exposing something that you may not have been aware of. So findings should be treated as opportunities for improvement. The findings, the reality is, looking at the thousands of reviews we've done, it is very, very rare that any workload is going to have zero improvement opportunities. There's almost always an area or opportunity to improve a workload. So what we've really learned is you should think about the findings in Well-Architected as how you can focus and prioritize improvements and expose risks you may not have been aware of. So that's really the way to think about it. Now, what are some of the use cases that we've seen around Well-Architected? So let's talk through some really common use cases. So the first thing is, most customers are using Well-Architected to learn about cloud best practices. That is, in fact, why we released the Well-Architected Framework as a public available doc, why we built the Well-Architected Tool so that customers can see it, and in fact, why the Well-Architected Tool is backed up by a wealth of information in the external website for Well-Architected. So when it comes to learning best practices for the cloud, Well-Architected is a great way to do that. Also, we see customers that are using it for technology governance. So the governance being a way to tell, am I doing the right things, and are people following best practices? And then lastly, we're also seeing customers now adopt a method to actually manage their portfolio and understand risk across their technology portfolio. So let's talk about how each of these use cases works and how Well-Architected can help you with them. So when it comes to learning cloud best practices, these are some of the questions that we tend to hear that really mean you could use Well-Architected as a way to learn about cloud best practices. If you're asking, well, how do I architect, or how do I operate in the cloud, or what's different about the cloud? If you are, thinking that maybe some of your design is being constrained based upon principles of an on-premise environment or an older IT solution, and you want to have something that's really designed to be cloud native. Many times there's so many resources, and the question is just, where do I start? How do I know what best practices or architecture should look like? Or if you're worried, am I doing this right? What are my risks? Have I done something wrong in my architecture? Those are the kinds of questions that usually mean you want to learn about what the best practices are for architecting and operating in the cloud. So if you want to learn those best practices, one second, apologize for that. So if you want to learn about those best practices, some things to think about is, how are you going to transition to being an older on-prem infrastructure to being cloud native? And cloud native means, how are you going to take advantage of the automation and the infrastructure as code, or even operations as code that are available in the cloud? Or more importantly, how are you going to take advantage of things that are different in the cloud? For example, cost. In an on-prem IT environment, cost is very much something that tends to be done around capital expenditures, whereas you move to the cloud, it's more like a utility, and it's something that where you're paying for it on demand as you use it. Are you making sure that you're thinking in a cloud native way about that? Also, what we provide for you is some signposting and resources. So it's not just, hey, here's what you should do, but if you need to do it, here's some resources that are going to help you learn what's available to help you do that. Now, obviously, we do start with a lot of the AWS services and capabilities that are available to do that, but we also talk about other solutions that we've seen customers develop. So it'll help you understand what AWS services and capabilities are useful in trying to reduce or mitigate or make improvements that have been identified. So when it comes to identifying those improvements, then the other thing that we want customers to get is the ability to inform future architectures. So we want you to learn over time, and as you're building your next generation of architecture, you should be able to learn the best practices and apply those as you continue to implement new workloads or resources in the cloud. Now moving on. What about technology governance? So what are some of the questions that we see driving the use of Well-Architected to help with technology governance? So first thing is operational readiness. One of the best reasons to do an operational readiness review is if you identify risks, or you're aware of the risks and can make an informed decision before you put a new product or a new feature into production. It's very useful at reducing the amount of downtime or impact or cost that you may not be aware of. So a lot of times when customers want to say, hey, how do I check to make sure that I'm really ready for production on a workload? That's a really great example of how Well-Architected can be used for technology governance. Also, a lot of times leadership wants to know, are the teams that I work with, are they following best practices? And if they are following them, how do I know? Are they measuring whether or not they're doing that consistently? Another thing to think about is, how are they ensuring that they're going to be able to take those risks that have been identified and actually burn them down? Are we addressing them? Are we allocating time to make the necessary improvements to reduce the risks that we've identified in order to make our workloads better over time? So when it comes to technology governance, if you really think about the 5 different pillars of Well-Architected, this is the way that Well-Architected can help solve for some of your technology governance needs. So across those 5 different pillars, the 5 different categories, it's going to give you a mechanism to consistently review all the workloads in your technology portfolio to understand, do they meet the best practices and do I understand the risks? It's going to make sure that it's done consistently across those 5 pillars. And also, it's going to make sure that you have a mechanism to do this across everything in your technology portfolio. So let's move on then to talk about how customers are using Well-Architected for portfolio management. Now, we know that quite often, especially in really large organizations, your technology portfolio may be really vast. There may be a lot of different things in that technology portfolio. So if there's so many different things in that portfolio, it's very rare that you have an inventory of all of the workloads and all of the resources that are in that portfolio. So we've seen customers starting to use Well-Architected and the tool as a mechanism to really manage their portfolio. If they don't know what the inventory of their workloads is, if they're not sure how those workloads are set up or what decisions around risks and going to production were made, if they don't know if those risks have changed over time, if they don't know where to invest resources in trying to make improvements and to solve for challenges that are helping or that are maybe preventing them from achieving the kind of business value that they want, and are there trends that need to be addressed holistically? There's another really big value in having all of the well-architected workloads put together. Often you can find something where, it seems like consistently we have this same risk that's coming up over and over again. Maybe it means I need better training. Maybe I need to create a reusable pattern that all of the technologies that I'm using can learn from so that we don't have that same risk continue to happen. That really is an example then of that last thing. Is there a way to build a mechanism so that I can do this, have a continuous, repeatable process that's consistent? So that's the way we see a lot of customers actually using the Well-Architected tool and the framework to do portfolio management. So if you really think about it, we've kind of changed the picture here. So if you need to manage that technology portfolio, this allows you to take every workload you have and document across all 5 of those pillars, how are the workloads established, what risks have been identified, how often have they been reviewed, what's the remediation of those, what's the improvement that's been made to those over time. So that's really how the Well-Architected tool and framework can be useful to helping you do portfolio management. All right, so with all of that said, we're gonna take a quick break here now and we're gonna jump over to a poll again. So the poll should be coming up for all of you. I'll read through the poll questions here and then give you 30 or 45 seconds to answer it. But now that you've learned about this, so we talked through the Well-Architected Framework and the Well-Architected Tool, giving you a good virtual workshop demo of it. So now that you've seen all this and you've seen what some of the use cases are from customers, how likely are you to use the Well-Architected Tool? So answer A, if you're already using it, which is great, love to hear that. If now that you've gotten this, you think you're actually likely to use this out on some of your workloads, or C, if you really don't think that it fits your needs or use cases, you're unlikely to use, or D, you're just not really sure at this point in time, so you need to spend more time digging into it. So I'll give you a few seconds more to answer that. All right. Give everybody about 15 more seconds here. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move on to our last section. So we're now in the final piece of the presentation for today. So after walking you through what the Well-Architected Framework is and the tool and how to use it, I think it's really important to point out a lot of the other resources that are available to help you when it comes to Well-Architected. So we're going to start with some of the tips. So we have tips to share. Honestly, this is things that a lot of customers may just not have been aware of, and I want to talk those through with you. So within the Well-Architected website, you're going to see links to a lot of other resources, not just the basics of the Well-Architected tool or the white papers that are there, but let's talk through those white papers. One important thing is the white papers are available to download as PDF, but they're also available as free Kindle books. So there is a Well-Architected Framework white paper that covers the entire framework and the general design principles across all 5 pillars. There's also an individual white paper for each one of the pillars. So you can get a white paper across operational excellence, the reliability, security, performance, efficiency, and cost optimization. There are also lens white papers, so I'll explain lenses here in a moment. And we do now have lens white papers for serverless, high-performance compute, and Internet of Things workloads. So if you're looking for guidance that are specific to architecture on those workloads, that's available as well. We do also have training. So the training is not just on the materials in the framework and the different pillars, but also how to perform the review process using things like we're doing today, as well as using the best practices for using the well-architected tool across your technology portfolio. Then lastly, it's very important, the WellArchitected website is an externally available website. It actually has all of the content and more for all of the things that you see in the WellArchitected tool. So it includes the glossary of terms we mentioned before. So the links in WellArchitected Tool will take you out to that glossary of terms and help you understand what do we mean when we talk about things like operations or runbooks or playbooks. So there's a lot of definitions in there, as well as resources that help you to better understand how you could use those glossary terms. We do also have the videos. So as you saw in the WellArchitected Tool, there's a short video snippet for each one of the questions to give you a brief introduction. Those videos are also available on the WellArchitected website. And more importantly, we have a map of the current version of the WellArchitected framework. So the map is actually an interactive map that will allow you to see all 5 of the pillars, the different areas. As I mentioned before, there's a focus area. Each of the pillars is broken into multiple focus areas. And then within those focus areas, it will allow you to see what the individual questions are inside of those and to have links that take you to those questions within the website. So, as I mentioned, we do have this framework. The important thing to recognize about the framework is all of the questions and the best practices are available in the WellArchitected Framework white paper, as well as in each of the questions for each pillar are available in the WellArchitected Pillar Framework white papers. So I highly encourage you either by going to the website and pulling down those white papers, or if you'd like, you can get the free Kindles as well. Give you the opportunity to see a lot more information, and we kind of expound on some of the ways that we've seen patterns that work really well. So this is going to allow you to see some patterns that are very useful when it comes to implementing these best practices. So to give you some examples of what are the different services and capabilities that can help you to implement the best practices that we've referenced in each one of those questions. Now, each pillar white paper also has a lot more detail about the pillar. So it'll dive into not only the different areas, but within each one of the focus areas of the pillar. It does include all the questions in the appendix at the end, but will also tell you for each one of those areas, how should you be thinking about that? What is the common way of thinking that may be where some of the problems come from around that particular question or concept? And then what are some of the ways you can think about implementing that best practice, and what's a pattern that looks like? Now, we also have all of the lenses. So each lens is we've recognized that there are sometimes very specific architectural decisions that need to be made depending on a specific type of technology used. So in this case, we do have them for serverless, for HPC, and for IoT. So those 3 lens framework white papers actually cover not just the best practices, but they all actually include some reference architectures that you can use to get an idea of what that best practice looks like when applied in an architectural environment. So definitely consider looking at those lenses if you are deciding to build a workload that is going to use serverless, high-performance compute, or IoT. Now, the other thing I mentioned before is there is a lot of free training material that's available. So if you look at the AWS.training site, you will see that there is training around the actual WellArchitected framework itself. There's training for each one of the pillars, and there is also training about how to do a WellArchitected review and how to use the WellArchitected tool. Then one more thing here to think about. This is just a high-level overview of the WellArchitected content website. So the WellArchitected content website includes a lot of different information. It definitely has all the information that you're going to find in the WellArchitected tool. So if you don't want to just go into the tool, you want to have a bigger review of all the content, you can get that here. You'll also see it helps you to start with a map. So this is the map that I was referencing. So there's a map that shows you each one of the 5 pillars, and within those pillars, each of the focus areas. And then when each of those areas, what are the questions that we ask? And the map is interactive, so you can use it to click and link your way through to things that you think are really of interest for you when it comes to understanding how to design, architect, and operate your workloads. And then lastly, as I mentioned, There's also a lot of other additional resources available in that external site. So it does have all the videos that give you the brief overview of the things that you should think about and what you should know. And then within each of those, you will see links to reference material. It includes blogs, other white papers, a whole lot of different content that you can use, both to understand why those particular best practices matter, and more importantly, what is the next thing you should consider if you want to implement those best practices in your environment. Then, as I mentioned, and as I showed you a little bit earlier, there's also the Well-Architected Labs. So Well-Architected Labs are a bunch of open source lab material. They are designed to allow you to understand some of these concepts in a much more hands-on way. So beyond just the walkthrough of the tool that I did for you today, what you're gonna see actually this is our first part of a 6-part series. So over the course of the next 5 series that we do, you're gonna be able to see information that's available in those labs done in a hands-on workshop format for you. But those are also available for you. If you have an account and you would like to spin up resources and test that out, we have those open source labs available for you. So you can see we've got the link popped up for you here. So if you want to try some of this hands-on and see what it looks like in a sample environment and have some basic patterns for how to implement these best practices, that's why Well-Architected Labs is there, and we'll continue to build new labs and be publishing new lab material in there regularly. So definitely take advantage of those free labs. So the last thing that I'd like to do today is dive in a little bit deeper on the design principles. So what we're gonna do here in our last few minutes is I'm gonna walk through at a high level, what are the overarching general design principles behind the Well-Architected framework? And then we'll talk briefly about the design principles that are specific to each one of the pillars, or what's inside the individual pillars. All right, so first off, the general design principles. So these are our general design principles that we think apply to all of Well-Architected. So now that if you're running workloads in the cloud, things have changed. Capacity is very different. The cloud has a virtually infinite capacity, so the ability to expand on demand as you need. So you should stop guessing at your capacity needs. You should really think about designing environments such that your capacity is something that either you understand or it can change on demand as it needs to. So really the cloud gives the ability to change your capacity on demand. Start taking advantage of that. The other thing about the cloud is because resources in the cloud are paid for on an on-demand basis, you should be able to spin up systems where you can test your production at scale. So a lot of times we have a testing environment in a traditional on-prem. It's very difficult or expensive to really test the full-scale environment when you have constrained resources. With AWS, because you can spin resources up and take them down very quickly, if you want to be able to test your production environments at scale, you can do that much more easily. We also talk about automating and making your architectural experimentation easier. So when we talk about automation, there's a lot of different ways to automate in AWS. That includes thinking about infrastructure as code, but we also think about things like doing your documentation as code or your operations as code. The idea of doing things where and even the responses to events being automated. So because everything can be treated as code, it allows you to have things that are triggered or happen automatically rather than having to wake up and engineer at 2 in the morning when necessary. And by doing that, it means you can experiment a lot more easily. So another thing to think about is make sure your architectures are designed so they're evolutionary. What we mean by that is AWS is constantly evolving. We're constantly creating new features, new capabilities, new services. You should design your workload so that the architecture allows you to do that as well. So there's a lot of different things that are embedded in that, but consider making it so that you have the ability to change things out as new features, services, and capabilities become available, which will allow you to reduce overhead and maybe get things to market a lot more quickly, or to make it so you can provide better business value. And then the last thing is we talk about this idea of improving through game days. So the idea behind a game day is that we want you to actually be able, if you can test production systems at scale, you should also be able to test the environments and the people and processes that you use to manage those environments on a regular basis. So if it's very easy to use code to rapidly deploy your environments and make them consistent with your production environment, game days allow you to test that and determine if not only is the architecture and the systems working, but are the people and processes themselves also capable of handling what your production environment needs are going to be. So there's our general design principles. So here's the design principles for the operational excellence pillar. So the first, as I mentioned, is designing operations as code. What we mean by that is there's a lot of activities that you do when an operating environment is up and running. So the vast majority of your workload lifecycle is probably spent in operations, not necessarily in design and architecture. So if you're going to do things on an environment when it's up and running, the best way to prevent human error is to put things in code so they can be executed and tested consistently. So things like runbooks and playbooks done as code, or even documentation as code, make that much easier to do. The next design principle then, annotating your documentation. That means consider treating your documentation as code, and I don't mean necessarily self-documenting code, but something as simple as putting information in your code about what version the documentation should be, and making sure that you check against your environment when changes are made to ensure the documentation is up to date. It's one example of how code annotation can help you ensure that people operating in the environment have the necessary and correct information to operate effectively. We also talk about the idea of making frequent small reversible change. Now, this is not always easy. This is probably one of the most difficult design principles. This is a good example of why thinking about these things early is useful. But a frequent small reversible change means that it's much easier to deploy more quickly if it's frequent. Small means that if there's a problem, it's much easier to roll back the problem that happens during a deployment, because you can easily identify what actually was the problem. And the reversible is very important. Now, we recognize that sometimes reversible is not always possible, but if you have the ability to reverse a change easily, that can make it so that it's easier to prevent downtime. The other thing is, things happen in operations all the time. If you're making changes to your application or your code or your environment, you should make sure that the operations procedures, things like runbooks and playbooks that your operating personnel uses, are kept up to date as that happens. We'll also talk about this. Anticipate failure. Now, anticipate failure doesn't mean just think that everything's going to break all the time. So the idea of anticipating failure isn't necessarily just expecting that things will break, but rather knowing where the areas are that could break and what the impact would be, and having plans and having mitigations in place beforehand. The last thing is, yes, sometimes things break. When they do, the worst thing that can happen is, and if you're out there in the audience, you might sheepishly raise your hand to yourself, have you ever had the same problem occur multiple times? If the same problem keeps occurring, it probably means something you need to learn from and keep from happening again. So it's a very, very important idea to learn from those failures and to find ways to improve over time to prevent them. So best practices are design principles are overarching for security. Make sure you have a strong identity foundation. So most of the things that happen when it comes to security involve not having well thought out credentials and identity management. So there's a lot of identity management tools in AWS. Make sure that you think about those ahead of time. Traceability is important, meaning being able to see every action that occurs and understand why and how that action was implemented, and to verify whether or not it was supposed to occur. Security at all layers. This is another very important security concept. In really modern complex systems, it's not just about having encryption. It's not just about having good IAM. It's about every layer of your architecture, considering from the application through the infrastructure that supports it, all of the people and processes that will be working on that, and all of the systems that are supporting that workload. Have you implemented good security best practices at all of those layers, not just at your edge? Automation is a really important thing. You'll see across Well-Architected. That's definitely a good design principle for security. We don't want to have the 2 a.m. call where the engineer is being, your security expert engineer is being woken up to respond to a security incident. Automate all of those security best practices where possible. Definitely think about things like encryption, so protecting your data both while it's in transit and at rest. As much as possible, keep people away from the data. Now, what we mean by that is not at the best network is a network with no users. Rather, what we mean is only give people access to the systems that present them with the data set that we need. You don't want your users or the people that are operating your environments to be directly acting on the data. They should rather be working with systems that help them control the access so they have appropriate access to that data. And the last thing is, we talked before, the general design principles of game days. Preparing for security incidents or security events is very definitely a good thing to do, and it kind of follows that same idea as game days. You should have game days where you test and you know if you have the people, the processes, and the technology in place to respond to security events. So in reliability, most importantly, test recovery procedures. So the greatest example of this is, many of you would say, sure, I have a backup plan. And then the next question would be, have you tested that backup plan? If you haven't tested that backup plan, I'm sorry, the answer is you don't actually have a backup plan. So the most common cause of failure when it comes to recovery is that they didn't test the recovery first. Again, because you can do things at scale, make sure, and you can also automate, consider having those recovery procedures tested. And as much as possible also, think about automation when it comes to recovering from failure. If you know what your failure points are, it means you should also be able to build scripted responses to those so that your systems are able to recover automatically. There's a lot of best practices that fall inside of that. The other thing to think about is scaling horizontally. So when it comes to reliability, one of the best ways to do that, and what AWS has a lot of services to help you do that, or features and capabilities, think about scaling out, not necessarily scaling up. So sometimes up is the only way that things work, but out is usually a lot better. So continuing to add more resources across your workload will help you to respond when there's potential reliability issues. As mentioned, going from that general design principle, same thing here. Don't guess at capacity. Use a lot of the service we have, like auto scaling and others, to make sure that your environments are able to scale in and out on demand as necessary. And then again, change is a requirement. The only constant is change. So in our environments, especially as new services, capabilities, and features are released, and also you want to provide new features, new capabilities for your customers on a regular basis, the only way that that happens consistently is through change. So if you're going to do change, automating the changes makes it much easier both to make sure the changes are tested and working correctly, but it also makes them easier to roll back and respond to. So performance efficiency, our best practices are democratize the advanced technologies. What we mean by that is make it so that everybody has access to the best things. So the problem is that you need to make sure the technology people are using is the right technology for the job. So the old adage that when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. We want to avoid that. Make sure that you're giving your teams access to the right resources for the right jobs.
I couldn't find a remote to pair. For help, go to your Alexa app.
Oh, she's so chatty today. Many apologies. So the other thing is go global. So you can go global in minutes. When it comes to performance efficiency, design your workloads so they can scale out as much as necessary, and if necessary, scale out globally. Consider using serverless architectures. The benefit of serverless architectures is it really reduces the amount of work that you have to spend. And then the other thing to think about when it comes to performance efficiency is you need to experiment much more often. So experimenting often is really, really important. And the last thing is, we talked about this idea of mechanical sympathy. So we tend to really force technologies to do what we need, and then we hope they get the performance what we need. We don't want to think about it that way. Rather, think about using the right technology for the right thing instead of trying to bend the technology to your will. All right, and then across cost optimization, our design principles, definitely think about adopting a consumption model. In other words, think about the way you use AWS as being a utility. How do you consume a utility? Think about the way that the AWS environment works and have a model for what your expected use is going to look like. So you really need to look at and consider what your use is. Do measure your efficiency. So there's the mantra that you can't manage what you don't measure. So you definitely want to measure, am I using my resources effectively? And if you are, then you have the ability to continue to improve that. If you're not, you can find the areas where you can make the biggest impact. Definitely stop spending money on data center operations. So there's a lot of benefits to the cloud. Don't treat the cloud as just another data center. That's what we're really trying to think about, the cloud native capabilities. Always make sure that you're analyzing and attributing expenditures. So know what things are costing and what is actually being used to get those costs. Am I delivering business value with those costs? That's the thing to think about when it comes to analyzing and being able to know what's costing you and why. And then the other thing is consider using managed services to reduce the cost of ownership. So it's great if everything is designed so that you're running and managing all of it, but a lot of times that management overhead, it means that it's going to cost you a lot more to do it. And a lot of the services that are managed for you, it takes the operational overhead away, and that's a lot of times a cost that's not thought about. So what do you need to do now? Let's finish off with this. How do we get started? So in order to get started, definitely go to the Well-Architected site. On the Well-Architected site, I've mentioned a whole lot of resources. Please consider spending the time to read through some of those online resources. Also, if you have an account team or if you need help finding a partner, reach out to a partner, talk to your account team, see if you can get assistance. And the best way to start really is to just do a review. Jump into the console, get a team together, pick a workload, and actually start doing a review of your first workload. So that is everything that I have today. Thank you very much. I believe what we're going to do now is actually jump over to the questions and answers. So I'm available now for a few more minutes to answer questions. If we have any questions, all right. So I'm looking through some of the questions that are there. I will see if I can get access to all of them. There is a question that's being asked about the poll. Are the results from the poll available? Can those be shared? Yes, okay, so they will share the poll results. I think another question that's come up a couple times is, so what about things like Trusted Advisor or other third-party tools that are capable of doing some automated things? So let's talk a little bit about where WellArchitected actually fits along with those other resources like like Trusted Advisor and other third-party tools you can put in an environment. So we very much see that Trusted Advisor is a great tool for going and looking at, again, a pillar-based approach and automatically identifying some of the best practices and how those best practices have been implemented or if they need to be implemented. We see that WellArchitected actually very much works in concert or as a complement to the Trusted Advisor tool, where WellArchitected was very much designed to be a conversation-driven approach. So you'll also see if you start to look through WellArchitected, there's a lot of questions, and I'll speak specifically to things like the operational excellence pillar, where we talk about things like how do you know you have enough trained personnel to meet the capabilities or requirements for a workload. Problem with that is it's very difficult to have an API call for that. So if you think about a lot of the things that we end up doing with WellArchitected, we're trying to drive discussion above and beyond just the things that we've now got these great automated tools to pull out of an environment. All right. So let's see. All right. Unfortunately, I'm not able to see. Is anybody able to share what our poll results were? All right. I think they're being shared up on the screen. All right. Let's see. What other questions do we have? Looking through. Many people, I do apologize for Alexa's chattiness today. She definitely wanted to join in the conversation. All right. Let's see. Are there any other questions? Not seeing any come up here.
I just muted us. You can pull it up
Sure.
on your desktop because
Gotcha.
I'm not showing your screen, so you can pull it up right there if
Brilliant.
you want, if it makes it easier.
I'll do that. Yeah,
And you're back on.
All right. So let's see. All right. So someone did ask if I could share the last page. All of this content will be available and published online, so we'll make sure that you have access to it. Again, that last page before thank you was about the WellArchitected website. So if you just go to aws.amazon.com and do a search for WellArchitected or aws.amazon.com/WellArchitected, it will bring up all the WellArchitected content for you. And everything we've talked about today is available through that. So let's see. Try and dig through some more of the questions here. So I see a question here was asked, so how do you do documentation as code? So to answer that, we don't think about documentation as code necessarily as, the magic of self-documenting code. Rather, when we talk about documentation as code, the idea would be embed the documentation about what is required to run or operate your workloads into the actual code base itself. Consider treating the documentation with the same level of discipline and rigor that you would code. So you can check it into shared repos, you can do code reviews on it. Annotating your documentation allows you to actually check and see, does the documentation version that I have match in my code and in the documentation via things like runbooks and playbooks that my teams need to operate or support my workload and application. So when we say documentation as code, that's really what we mean is put your documentation into the same format and same code base as you do for your application code, for your infrastructure as code, maybe even for things like your operations as code, runbooks and playbooks. Hope that answers that. Let's see. So does the tool provide guidance for specific languages? I believe that the website itself is regionalized, so there are several languages available. I'll have to check in and see what languages are available there, but the website actually has a lot of different is regionalized, so it's going to be available in different languages. I'm wondering if one of our WellArchitected SMEs can share the status on that, because I'm not actually So can we have an account with only access to the WellArchitected tool? So it's actually, thank you for asking that question. The WellArchitected tool does have 2 IAM permissions that can be used or assigned to it. Those permissions are to give you read or write access. So basically it's view or full access. So the WellArchitected view allows you to see the results of any WellArchitected review in the account that you're referencing. And the full gives you the ability to go in and make changes. So those are the 2 that are available. So if you did want to make this something where you had an account that you store these all in and people could only use it for WellArchitected, you are capable of using IAM roles to do that. Right. Continue to read through. All right, so there's a question that's asked, so how does the WellArchitected framework help with compliance frameworks like ISO 27001? So there is actually, I want everyone should be aware of this, there is a compliance site that's available for AWS that lists the different features and services for compliance. When we think about WellArchitected when it comes to compliance, really how it helps is that it's a tool that allows you to consistently review your workloads. So if you think about like the operational excellence pillar, there is a question where we specifically ask, do you actually consider compliance requirements? Now that question, to be clear, isn't just about compliance around frameworks like ISO standards or around things like PCI compliance or whatever regional governance and compliance you might need. We're also thinking about compliance. Do you have internal security or governance teams that have standards you have to adhere to? So thinking about compliance in the big picture, the benefit of the WellArchitected tool is that WellArchitected is a central place where you can document whether or not you're following standards, and using that open-ended text, you would be able to, for any workload or everything in your technology portfolio, document and make it searchable or discoverable as to whether or not you're following a particular compliance framework in that workload. All right, continue to read. Great. Okay, so there's a question asked, for those that are not working in a production environment, just working on their own at a beginner level, what is some thoughts on how to go about familiarizing yourself with the WellArchitected tool apart from the reading? So a couple of things to consider. One, the WellArchitected tool, this is an important thing I wanted to mention. WellArchitected is available at no additional cost in the console. So you don't incur any charges for using the WellArchitected tool. You can create as many reviews as you want. Honestly, one of the best ways to really learn about the tool besides the reading itself is to actually just go in and start using the tool. The tool is a great way to kind of get a summary overview of the kind of questions that we think about. So if you don't want to just do reading, you want more of a hands-on exercise, do definitely consider doing that. Also, if you look inside of the WellArchitected Framework white papers, even though I apologize, it is a lot of reading, the WellArchitected Framework white papers do contain some sample examples of how you might implement these. Now, if you don't want to do reading at all and you're looking just to kind of test and learn, the other really good resource to consider is, as I mentioned before, those WellArchitected labs. So the WellArchitected labs will allow you to go into, if you have a test AWS environment, so you can sign up for a free tier account. And if you go into that environment using the WellArchitected labs, it'll actually allow you to do hands-on exercises that walk you through what it would look like in a real-world environment inside of an AWS account to establish some of those best practices and to utilize them. So you'll be able to see actually over the course of the next 5 weeks, the next 5 sessions here, what that actually looks like through the labs that will be demonstrated in those virtual workshops. So there's a question asked, how limited is the WA tool against other cloud providers? So the reality is that the WellArchitected tool has all of our aggregate AWS best practices, but it doesn't actually reference any specific AWS service or feature in those questions. It's actually designed around best practices in general. So this is something that there is no limit. You can use it against other cloud providers or even your on-prem environments if you want to. It's really talking about what we've learned from AWS customers as best practices for cloud. A lot of the remediation plans and things that are follow-on that you want to do are going to be very specific to AWS, but the tool itself is not just for AWS. You can actually use it anywhere that you think would be worthwhile. So is the WA tool supposed to be used for design and assessment? You can absolutely use it for doing design and for operational readiness reviews. So we've seen customers do that. As I mentioned, the earlier you use it, the better. So if you move it as far as you can into the design phase, tend to get more value because it helps you to prevent or mitigate risk before you go to production. It's definitely great as an operational readiness review tool to ensure that you're meeting the standards that have been established. But we also recommend running it against current workloads to see maybe you have workloads that have been running for a while and they might need updates or changes made to them to implement new best practices that have been recognized. So it's something that we think is good for design, it's good for operational readiness review, and it's also good to be run on current production workloads on a regular basis. So there's a question, I'm wondering about implications of using the tool to evaluate a workload in a region that doesn't have the tool available, or where there's geographical constraints on data for compliance reasons. So things to consider, again, the way the tool works, because it's not using API calls, it's designed to be discussion driven. It doesn't have to be something where you're running it just against the resources in the region or the account that you're doing it. So you can do that anywhere. The key thing is think about the information that you're putting in about the workload. If there are compliance requirements or restrictions or regulatory compliance restrictions, if possible, use a region that meets those compliance requirements, or ensure that the content that you're putting in is something that is not going to require you to comply with those standards. So keep in mind what kind of information you're putting in when you're doing that. All right, it looks like we are running down to the end of time here, actually. So with that, we're going to be ending the episode. Thank you very much. What are we going to do as far as, quick question, as far as the rest of the questions that are here? Is there another place for people to go to get questions answered? Any feedback?
We can continue answering them in the chat.
Okay, so you can continue to ask questions in the chat, and we'll continue to answer for them there. But thank you all again very much for your time today. So I'm John Steele, Cloud Operations Specialist, and thank you very much for joining Are You Well Architected?